The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind him, with a sound that echoed through the concrete hallway. It was the kind of sound that made your stomach drop, the kind that reminded you there was no going back. Robert Chen stood perfectly still, his hands cuffed in front of him, waiting for whatever came next. He was 57 years old, though the gray in his hair made him look older. Average height, slim build, the kind of guy you wouldn't look at twice if you passed him on the street. His eyes were different, though. They had this quiet, faraway look, like he was watching everything from behind a thick pane of glass. The processing room at Riverbend State Prison smelled like industrial cleaner and old sweat. 3 guards moved around him with practiced efficiency, taking his civilian clothes, handing him the standard orange jumpsuit that every inmate wore. Robert changed without a word, folding his old clothes neatly even though he knew he wouldn't see them again for years. "First time inside?" one of the younger guards asked, not really interested in the answer. "Yes, sir," Robert replied softly. The guard almost looked surprised at the politeness. Most guys coming in were either scared out of their minds or trying to act tough. This one just seemed resigned, like he'd already accepted his fate before he even walked through those doors. They assigned him to Cell Block D, a medium security wing that housed about 200 inmates. As Robert walked down the long corridor with a guard escort, dozens of eyes tracked his movement. This was the moment every new inmate dreaded. The moment when everyone sized you up, decided if you were strong or weak, dangerous or harmless. Robert kept his eyes forward, his footsteps steady. He didn't try to look tough or scared. He just walked like a man going to catch a bus, ordinary and unremarkable. His cellmate was already waiting when the guard opened the door to cell 247. The guy was built like a linebacker, covered in tattoos that crawled up his neck and across his knuckles. His name was Devin, and he looked Robert up and down with obvious disappointment. "You've got to be kidding me," Devin muttered. "They stick me with Grandpa?" Robert said nothing. He simply placed his thin mattress on the empty bunk and sat down with his hands folded in his lap. "You hear me talking to you?" Devin's voice had an edge to it now. "I heard you," Robert said quietly. "Just trying to stay out of your way." Devin grunted and turned back to the magazine he'd been reading. But Robert could feel the calculation happening. He'd just been marked as weak, and in here that was the worst thing you could be. The first week passed in a blur of new routines. Wake up at 6, head count, breakfast in the cafeteria, work assignment in the prison laundry, lunch, yard time, dinner, back to the cell. Lights out at 10. Every day exactly the same, and every day the testing began, it started small. Devin would take Robert's soap without asking, use his towel, eat his dessert from his lunch tray. Robert never said a word. He'd just use water to wash his hands, dry them on his shirt, go without the extra food. It was like he didn't even notice. In the cafeteria, a group of younger guys started bumping into him on purpose. The first time, his tray clattered to the floor, scattering food everywhere. Robert just bent down, cleaned up the mess with paper napkins, and got back in line for another tray. No anger, no complaint. He just did what needed to be done. "Man, this guy's like a robot," one of them said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Doesn't even get mad." The word spread fast. There was a new guy in D Block who wouldn't fight back, who took everything without saying a word. In prison, that kind of weakness was like blood in the water. By the second week, it got worse. A gang member named Trevor started demanding Robert's phone privileges. In prison, phone time was everything. It was your connection to the outside world, to family, to anyone who still remembered you existed. But when Trevor cornered Robert in the yard and told him to hand over his phone card, Robert just reached into his pocket and gave it to him. Just like that, Trevor seemed almost offended by how easy it was. "You're not even going to ask why." "Would it change anything?" Robert asked simply. Trevor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're going to have a real hard time in here, old man." Robert just nodded slowly and walked away to the corner of the yard where he usually sat, pulling out one of the worn paperback books from the prison library. He always had a book with him. Western novels, mysteries, old thrillers with cracked spines and yellow pages. He'd sit in the same spot every day, reading quietly while the yard bustled with activity around him. The other inmates found this hilarious. Here was this guy getting pushed around, robbed, disrespected, and he just sat there reading like he was at a park on Sunday afternoon. They started calling him Professor as a joke. mocking the way he always had his nose in a book. One afternoon in the laundry room, things escalated. Robert was folding sheets from the industrial dryers when someone shoved him hard from behind. He stumbled forward into a rolling cart full of dirty linens, his glasses flying off his face and skittering across the concrete floor. Laughter erupted around him. 3 guys stood there grinning, waiting to see what he'd do. Robert slowly pushed himself up, located his glasses, and carefully put them back on. One lens was cracked now, splitting his vision. He looked at the 3 men for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes. Something dark and old and dangerous. Then it was gone. Just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished behind that faraway look again. "Sorry," Robert said quietly. "I should have been paying attention." He went back to folding sheets. His hands were shaking slightly, but his face remained calm. One of the guards, a woman named Patricia who'd been working at Riverbend for 15 years, watched the whole thing from her position by the door. She'd seen a lot of inmates come and go, seen tough guys crack under pressure and quiet guys explode into violence. But Robert was different. There was something about the way he absorbed every humiliation that bothered her. It wasn't fear. She knew what fear looked like. This was something else entirely. It was like watching someone serve out a sentence they'd given themselves, separate from whatever the judge had decided. That night, lying in his bunk while Devon snored above him, Robert stared at the ceiling. The concrete was stained and cracked, marked by years of other inmates who'd laid in this same spot, staring at this same ceiling, counting down their days. He wasn't counting. Time didn't matter much anymore. Nothing did, really. He'd come to prison for a reason, served his time for a crime he'd committed. But the real punishment, the one that actually hurt, had started long before he ever walked through these doors. The bullying, the theft, the disrespect. It was just noise, background static to the much louder silence inside his own head. Robert closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same. And he'd accept it all, just like he'd accepted everything else, because somewhere deep down he believed he deserved it. 3 months into his sentence, Robert had become something of a legend in Cell Block D. Not the good kind of legend. He was the guy everyone knew they could push around without consequences. The punching bag, the easy target. The harassment had evolved from simple theft into something more systematic. It was like the other inmates had turned bullying Robert into a sport, seeing who could come up with new ways to make his life miserable. In the shower room one Tuesday morning, Robert stood under the lukewarm spray trying to wash quickly. He'd learned to shower during the least crowded times, but it didn't always help. 3 inmates walked in, and Robert immediately knew what was coming. He'd seen that particular look before. "Hey, Professor," one of them called out. "You using that soap?" Before Robert could answer, they'd grabbed his soap, his towel, even his shower shoes. They walked out laughing, leaving him standing there dripping wet with nothing to dry off with. Robert waited until they were gone, then used his hands to squeegee as much water off his body as he could. He walked back to his cell barefoot, leaving wet footprints on the cold concrete floor. Devon looked up from his bunk and shook his head. "Man, you are pathetic. You know that." Robert didn't respond. He just put on his prison uniform and got ready for breakfast. The cafeteria was always the worst. It was where hierarchies were on full display, where the strong sat in the center tables and the weak hugged the walls. Robert had his routine down by now. Get his tray, find a corner spot, eat quickly, get out. But even that simple plan rarely worked. "Yo, watch where you're going." The shove came from nowhere and Robert's tray went flying. Mashed potatoes splattered across the floor. The mystery meat slid under a nearby table. His milk carton exploded on impact, creating a white puddle. "My bad, Professor," the guy said with a grin that said it was anything but an accident. "You should really be more careful." Robert knelt down and started cleaning up the mess with napkins from a nearby dispenser. Other inmates stepped around him, some laughing, others just ignoring him completely. One guard glanced over but didn't move to help. Just another day in D Block. By the time Robert cleaned everything up and got back in line, lunch period was almost over. He grabbed a piece of bread and an apple, then headed to his work assignment. His stomach growled, but he'd gotten used to being hungry. The laundry room was hot and loud, filled with the rumble of industrial washers and dryers. Robert worked the folding station, methodically folding sheet after sheet. It was mindless work, which he preferred. Less thinking meant less remembering, and remembering was the last thing he wanted to do. But today, the universe had other plans. Yo, old man, you're taking up too much space. Robert looked up to find himself face to face with a guy everyone called Big Tommy. The nickname was accurate. The man was 6'4" and probably weighed 250 pounds. Most of it muscle. I can move, Robert said quietly, already stepping to the side. Too late. Big Tommy shoved him, not hard enough to really hurt, but hard enough to send Robert stumbling backward into a cart of dirty sheets. Robert's glasses flew off again, and this time they landed near a drain grate. He heard the crack before he even picked them up. Both lenses were shattered now, held together only by the frame. When Robert put them on, the world became a fractured puzzle of blurry shapes. Oops, Big Tommy said, walking away. Robert carefully removed the broken glasses and tucked them into his pocket. He'd have to file a request for new ones, which could take weeks. Until then, he'd navigate the world in soft focus, which somehow felt appropriate. Officer Patricia Gomez had been watching from her station near the door. She'd seen the whole thing, and something about it bothered her more than usual. She'd been working at Riverbend for 15 years, had seen every kind of inmate there was. But Robert didn't fit any category she knew. Most victims of prison bullying fell into predictable patterns. They got angry and eventually fought back, usually making things worse. Or they broke down, crying, begging for protective custody. Or they withdrew completely, becoming shells of themselves. Robert did none of these things. He just endured. Like he was serving a sentence within his sentence, one he'd imposed on himself. During her break, Patricia pulled Robert's file. The basics were there. Robert Chen, age 57, 7-year sentence for aggravated assault. He'd beaten a man outside a bar badly enough to put him in the hospital for 2 weeks. Broken jaw, fractured ribs, internal bleeding. The victim had needed surgery. But as Patricia read deeper, details emerged that hadn't been emphasized in the official sentencing. The police report mentioned that multiple witnesses saw the victim trying to force an unconscious young woman into his car. Robert had intervened. According to statements, the man had pulled a knife. Robert disarmed him and then, in the words of one witness, just kept hitting him even after the guy was down. The victim turned out to be a registered offender with priors for similar crimes. Robert's lawyer had tried to argue self-defense and defense of others, but Robert himself had refused to fight the charges. He'd stood in court and said simply, "I lost control. I'm guilty." Patricia closed the file, more confused than before. The man in that police report who'd disarmed someone with a knife and fought like a trained fighter. That man didn't match the quiet, passive inmate getting bullied every single day. That evening in the yard, Patricia watched Robert from her post. He sat in his usual corner with a book held close to his face since his glasses were broken. Every few minutes, someone would walk past and say something. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see Robert's lack of reaction. He just kept reading or pretending to read. Trevor, the gang leader who'd been taking Robert's phone privileges, approached with 2 of his crew. Patricia tensed, ready to intervene if things got physical. But Trevor just stood there talking while Robert looked up at him with that same calm, distant expression. After a minute, Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out something. His commissary card, the little bit of money inmates could use to buy snacks, toiletries, stamps. Trevor took it and walked away laughing. Patricia shook her head. That commissary money was probably all Robert had, and he'd just handed it over like it meant nothing. Her partner, Officer James Chen, walked up beside her. "That guy's not going to make it," he said, nodding toward Robert. "Someone's going to really hurt him eventually." "Maybe," Patricia said. "Or maybe he's tougher than he looks." "Tougher, that guy? He lets everyone walk all over him." Patricia didn't respond. She just kept watching Robert, who'd gone back to his book, holding it inches from his face so he could read the blurry words. That night, the cell block was loud. Someone's radio was playing music. Voices bounced off the concrete walls. Devin was on the top bunk telling a story to someone in the next cell about some fight he'd won on the outside. Robert lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling through his broken glasses, which he still wore even though they barely helped. The cracks in the lenses made the ceiling look like a spider web, fractures spreading in every direction. He thought about his son, about his wife who'd left, about the 8 men who'd died while he lived, about the young woman he'd saved and the man he'd nearly killed in the process, about how every punch he'd thrown that night felt like he was hitting someone else, something else, all the rage and grief and guilt that he'd been carrying finally finding a target. The judge had given him 7 years. But Robert knew the truth. No sentence could be long enough. No amount of punishment could balance the scales of what he'd lost and what he'd failed to protect. So he let them take his soap, his food, his phone time, his money, his dignity, because somewhere deep in his broken heart, Robert believed he deserved every bit of it. And the scary part, the part that kept Officer Patricia up at night after her shift ended, was wondering what would happen if Robert ever stopped believing that. If that quiet, passive man ever decided he'd been punished enough. She had a feeling that whoever was around when that happened would learn a very hard lesson about judging books by their covers. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Officer Patricia Gomez and her partner James were doing routine cell inspections in D Block. Standard procedure, checking for contraband, making sure everything was by the book. Most cells were the same. A few personal photos taped to the wall, maybe some letters, commissary snacks hidden under bunks. But when they got to cell 247, Patricia noticed something different about Robert's area. While Devon's side was covered with magazine pictures and drawings, Robert's side was almost bare. Just a small bundle of letters tied with string, a few photographs, and a worn leather journal tucked under his thin mattress. "Let's see what we got here," James said, pulling out the items for inspection. The first thing that caught Patricia's eye was how old everything looked. The letters were yellowed at the edges, the photographs bent and faded like they'd been looked at 1,000 times. James opened the bundle of letters while Patricia picked up the photos. She almost dropped them. The first photo showed Robert, but not the Robert she knew. This Robert was younger, probably in his 30s, standing tall in a military dress uniform. The uniform was crisp and decorated with multiple ribbons and medals across the chest. Behind him was a tan building with a sign that read, "Forward Operating Base Phoenix." "James," Patricia said quietly. "Look at this." James glanced over and his entire body went still. He set down the letters he was holding and took the photo from Patricia's hands. As a former Marine, he recognized those medals immediately. "Is that? No way." James pulled out his phone and zoomed in on the photo. "That's a silver star, and those are bronze stars. Multiple bronze stars." They looked at each other, then back at the small pile of Robert's possessions. James picked up another photo. This one showed Robert in combat gear, kneeling beside a group of children in front of a makeshift medical tent. His face was younger, but his eyes had that same faraway look, like he was already seeing things that would haunt him forever. Another photo showed Robert receiving some kind of commendation from a high-ranking officer. Another showed him with a military unit, 8 other men in combat gear all smiling at the camera. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, "Alpha Team, best brothers a man could ask for." Patricia's hands were shaking as she picked up the letters. The first one was from someone named Chaplain Rodriguez, dated 3 years ago. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it anyway. What you did in Kandahar saved my life. I was hit going into shock, and you carried me 3 miles through active enemy fire to the extraction point." 3 miles. The doctor said another 10 minutes and I would have bled out. You gave me those 10 minutes and a whole lot more. I got to see my daughter graduate high school last week. I got to walk her down the aisle at her wedding last month. I got to hold my grandson for the first time 2 weeks ago. All because you didn't leave me behind. I owe you everything." James had gone pale. He picked up another letter, this one from a Colonel Patterson. "Captain Chen, I'm writing to inform you that your recommendation for the Medal of Honor has been reviewed. While the committee decided on the Silver Star instead, I want you to know that what you did during the ambush was the bravest thing I've witnessed in 30 years of service. You held that position alone for 6 hours against overwhelming enemy forces while your team evacuated wounded. 6 hours. You saved 12 lives that day, including mine. The Army is lesser without you, but I understand your decision to separate. You've given enough. More than enough." Patricia felt like the floor had shifted under her feet. This couldn't be the same man. The quiet inmate who let everyone steal from him, push him around, treat him like he was nothing. That man was a decorated war hero? "We need to search the database," James said, already pulling out his tablet. He still had access to military records from his time in the Corps. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing in Robert's full name. The file that came up was extensive. Captain Robert Chen, United States Army Special Forces. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Silver Star for Valor. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal with Valor. Combat Infantryman Badge. The list went on and on. James scrolled through the commendations, reading them out loud in a voice that got quieter with each one. Single-handedly held a defensive position for 6 hours under heavy enemy fire while evacuating wounded personnel. Led a rescue mission that extracted 12 civilians from a collapsed building during active combat operations. Disarmed and neutralized multiple enemy combatants to protect his unit. Carried a wounded chaplain 3 miles through hostile territory to medical evacuation. Patricia sat down on the edge of Robert's bunk, her legs suddenly weak. She thought about all the times she'd watched him get bullied. The showers, the cafeteria, the laundry room. This man had fought in actual combat, had saved lives under fire, had been decorated for extraordinary bravery. And he was letting petty criminals steal his soap? There's more, James said, his voice grim now. He'd scrolled to the end of the file, to the notes section. His entire unit was killed in an IED explosion. 8 men. He was the only survivor. The photo, the one with Robert and his team, all of them smiling. All of them dead now except him. James kept reading, pulling information from connected databases. His wife divorced him while he was overseas and... He paused, his face going even paler. His son died 2 years ago, overdose. He was 17. Patricia felt sick. She looked around the bare cell, at the few photos, at the letters from people whose lives Robert had saved, and she understood. Finally, she understood. He's punishing himself, she whispered. James nodded slowly. The assault charge. The bar fight. I'm going to pull that report. It took him a few minutes to access the police database, but when he did, the full story came together like pieces of a horrible puzzle. Robert had witnessed a registered offender trying to force an unconscious woman into a car. He'd intervened. The man pulled a knife. Robert disarmed him with techniques clearly learned from military combat training, but he didn't stop there. According to witness statements, Robert kept hitting the man even after he was down, even after the threat was over. The police report noted that it took 2 officers to pull Robert off. He was shouting something, but the words were unclear. One witness thought he heard Robert yelling a name, his son's name. The guy he beat up looked like his son's dealer, James said quietly. Different guy, but similar description. Robert must have snapped. Patricia put her head in her hands. This man had lost everything. His unit, his marriage, his son. And then he'd saved someone's daughter but nearly killed a man in the process. And now he was in prison, letting himself be treated like trash because somewhere in his broken mind he believed he deserved it. We need to tell the warden, Patricia said. Are you sure? James asked. Robert clearly doesn't want anyone to know about this. Look at him, James. He's letting them destroy him. He's a war hero and he's acting like he's nothing. Someone needs to intervene before this gets worse. That evening they met with Warden Torres in his office. They brought the photos, the letters, the military records. The warden sat behind his desk reading through everything with an expression that shifted from surprise to shock to something like anger. How did we not know this? He asked. He never mentioned it, Patricia said. At his trial during processing, never. He didn't want anyone to know. The warden picked up the photo of Robert with his unit. 8 smiling faces, all gone now except one. He's the only survivor? Yes, sir. The warden was quiet for a long time. Outside his office window, they could see the yard where inmates were getting their evening recreation time. Somewhere out there was Robert, probably sitting in his corner with a book, probably being harassed by someone who had no idea who they were messing with. What do you think we should do? The warden asked. I think, Patricia said carefully, that these men need to know who Robert really is, not to get him special treatment, but because respect is earned, and Robert earned it long before he ever came here. He just forgot that somewhere along the way. The warden nodded slowly. There's a prison-wide assembly scheduled for Friday. Mandatory attendance. He looked at the photo again, at the young Robert in his dress uniform covered in medals for bravery. I think it's time everyone learned who's been living in cell block D. James and Patricia left the office as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prison yard. Neither of them could stop thinking about Robert, about the secrets he'd been carrying, about the weight of a guilt so heavy that prison felt like mercy. Do you think he'll be okay? James asked. When everyone finds out? Patricia watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the prison walls. I don't know, but at least he won't be invisible anymore. Friday morning came with the usual sounds of prison life. Metal doors clanging open, guards shouting head counts, hundreds of men shuffling through their morning routines. Robert sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at nothing in particular. His broken glasses were still taped together, giving the world that fractured puzzle piece quality he'd almost gotten used to. Assembly today, Devon said from the top bunk. Probably another lecture about contraband or fighting. Waste of time? Robert just nodded. He'd learned that most things in prison were a waste of time, but you did them anyway because you had no choice. That was the whole point of being here. The cafeteria doubled as the assembly hall. By 9 o'clock, nearly 300 inmates were packed into the space, sitting at the long tables they normally ate at. Guards lined the walls more than usual. The atmosphere felt different somehow, charged with something Robert couldn't quite identify. He sat in his usual spot near the back, trying to be invisible. Trevor walked past and knocked Robert's arm off the table, not even looking back. A few guys laughed. Robert just put his arm back and waited for whatever was about to happen. Warden Torres walked to the front of the room, and the noise level dropped. The warden was a big man with gray hair and a stern face that didn't tolerate nonsense. He rarely spoke at assemblies, usually leaving that to his deputies. But today he was holding a folder and had a microphone in his hand. "Gentlemen," the warden began, his voice echoing through the cafeteria, "I'm going to do something today that I've never done in my 23 years as warden. I'm going to tell you about one of your fellow inmates." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was unusual. The warden didn't single people out unless someone had done something seriously wrong. "There's a man in this room," the warden continued, "who has been here for 4 months now. Some of you know him. Some of you have taken things from him. Some of you have pushed him around, stolen his food, made his life difficult." Robert felt his stomach drop. He knew somehow that this was about him. He wanted to stand up and leave, but guards had moved to block the exits. Everyone was going to be here for this, whatever this was. "I want to tell you who this man really is," the warden said, opening his folder. "His name is Robert Chen. Before he came here, he served in the United States Army for 18 years. He was a captain in the Special Forces." The room went completely silent. Every eye started searching, trying to figure out who the warden was talking about. Captain Chen served 3 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has a Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. He has 2 Bronze Stars with valor devices. He has a Purple Heart, which means he was wounded in action. He has an Army Commendation Medal with valor device and multiple other commendations for bravery under fire. Robert closed his eyes. This was his worst nightmare. He didn't want this. He didn't deserve this. "Let me read you some of what Captain Chen did," the warden said, pulling out a paper. "During an ambush in Afghanistan, when his unit came under heavy enemy fire, Captain Chen held a defensive position alone for 6 hours while his team evacuated wounded personnel. 6 hours. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he didn't retreat. He saved 12 lives that day. You could hear a pin drop in that cafeteria. 300 men who thought they were tough were listening to the story of someone who'd faced actual combat. On another occasion, Captain Chen carried a wounded chaplain 3 miles through hostile territory to reach medical evacuation. The chaplain was going into shock and would have died if Captain Chen hadn't gotten him to help. 3 miles with a full-grown man on his back through an active combat zone. The warden paused, looking around the room. Captain Chen led a rescue mission that saved 12 civilians, including children, from a collapsed building during active combat operations. He personally pulled people from the rubble while under enemy fire. Robert could feel people turning to look at him now, putting the pieces together. The quiet guy in the back who never fought back, who let everyone walk all over him. That guy did all this? Captain Chen's entire unit was killed in an explosion. The warden continued, his voice softer now. 8 men that he'd served with for years. He was the sole survivor. He came home to find his wife had left him, and 6 months before his arrest, his 17-year-old son died. The room felt heavy with that information. Even the hardest men in there understood that kind of loss. Losing your brothers in arms, your family, your son, that was a different kind of prison than anything they knew. The crime that brought Captain Chen here, the warden said, was assault. He witnessed a registered sex offender attempting to force an unconscious woman into a car. He intervened. The man pulled a knife. Captain Chen disarmed him using his military training, and then he lost control. He beat that man severely. Too severely. He broke the law. The warden closed his folder. Captain Chen stood in court and pleaded guilty. He didn't use his military service as a defense. He didn't mention his PTSD or his grief or anything that might have reduced his sentence. He just said, "I lost control. I'm guilty." And he came here to serve his time. Robert could feel 300 pairs of eyes on him now. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never be seen again. "I'm telling you this," the warden said, his voice firm, "because this man has been disrespected, robbed and bullied since the day he arrived, and he never once fought back. Not because he couldn't, but because somewhere in his mind he believed he deserved it." The warden pointed to the back of the room, right at Robert. "Captain Robert Chen is sitting in the back." "Stand up, Captain." Robert didn't want to. Every fiber of his being resisted. But a guard nearby nodded at him, and Robert slowly, reluctantly stood up. His legs felt shaky. His broken glasses barely let him see the faces staring at him. "This man," the warden said, "saved lives in combat. He's a decorated war hero, and some of you have been treating him like garbage. I want you to think about that. Think about who you've been stealing from, who you've been pushing around." The silence in that room was absolute. "We're all here because we broke the law," the warden continued, Captain Chen included. "But respect isn't about what crime you committed. It's about who you are as a person, what you've done with your life. And this man has done more for his country and for strangers than most of us will ever do." The warden looked directly at Robert. "You can sit down, Captain." Robert sat down quickly, his face burning. He felt exposed, raw, like every protective layer he'd built around himself had been stripped away. "Assembly dismissed," the warden said. But nobody moved at first. They just sat there processing what they'd heard. Then slowly people started standing up to leave. As they filed out, Robert noticed something strange. People weren't laughing or making jokes. They were quiet. Some were looking at him with something that looked like shame. Others looked away entirely, unable to meet his eyes. Trevor, the gang leader who'd been taking Robert's phone privileges, walked past. He stopped, turned around, and came back. Robert braced himself for another confrontation, but Trevor just stood there for a moment, then said quietly, "I didn't know, man. I'm sorry." He walked away before Robert could respond. Devin, his cellmate, appeared next to him. "Why didn't you say anything? Why'd you let us treat you like that?" Robert looked at him with those sad, distant eyes. "Because I didn't think I mattered anymore." "Well," Devin said after a long pause, "you do." As the cafeteria emptied, Robert sat alone at his table. Officer Patricia approached and sat down across from him. She didn't say anything at first. "I didn't want this," Robert said quietly. "I know," Patricia replied. "But maybe you needed it anyway." Robert shook his head. "I don't deserve respect. Not after what I did. Not after I lost control." "You saved a woman's life," Patricia said. "Yes, you went too far. Yes, you're paying for that. But that doesn't erase everything else you've done. Your son wouldn't want you to punish yourself forever." At the mention of his son, Robert's eyes filled with tears. The first emotion Patricia had seen from him in 4 months. "You don't know what he'd want. He's gone because I wasn't there. He's gone because of a disease called addiction," Patricia said firmly. "Not because of you. And the 8 men you served with, they died in war. That's not your fault either. You can't carry all that guilt forever, Robert. It'll kill you." Robert wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Maybe that's what I deserve." "No," Patricia said, standing up. "What you deserve is a chance to heal. And whether you like it or not, that process just started." She walked away, leaving Robert alone in the empty cafeteria, sitting at a table where just minutes ago 300 men learned that the quiet inmate they'd been bullying was someone completely different than they'd imagined. Someone who'd once been a hero, even if he couldn't see it anymore. The days after the assembly were strange. Robert woke up expecting the usual routine of harassment and theft, but instead found something he hadn't experienced in years. Respect. Devin stopped taking his things. In fact, his cellmate started asking permission before using anything, even the small stuff like borrowing a pen. The change was awkward at first. Devin didn't know how to act around Robert now, and Robert didn't know how to handle being treated like a human being again. In the cafeteria, something remarkable happened. Robert got his tray and headed to his usual corner spot, but this time nobody bumped into him. Nobody knocked his tray out of his hands. A few guys actually moved aside to let him pass. When he sat down, an older inmate with gray in his beard came over and sat across from him. "Marines 2003, the man said, extending his hand. "Did 2 tours in Iraq. Name's Vincent." Robert shook his hand hesitantly. "Army, Robert." "I know who you are," Vincent said with a small smile. "Everyone does now. There's about 10 of us vets in here. We meet Tuesday nights in the library for a support group. You should come." Robert wanted to say no. He'd spent 4 months avoiding connection, avoiding anything that might make him feel human again. But something in Vincent's eyes stopped him, a kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. "Maybe," Robert said quietly. "That's good enough for now," Vincent replied, standing up. "Offer stands whenever you're ready." The biggest shock came in the yard that afternoon. Robert was sitting in his corner with a book, same as always, when Trevor approached. But this time, 2 of his crew weren't with him to laugh and intimidate. Trevor was alone, and he looked uncomfortable. "Can I sit?" Trevor asked. Robert nodded, too surprised to speak. Trevor sat down on the concrete, his back against the fence. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, "My grandfather was in Vietnam Army. He never talked about it much, but sometimes I'd catch him staring at nothing, you know? Like his mind was somewhere else." Robert knew that look. He'd seen it in mirrors. "He had this box in his closet," Trevor continued, "full of medals and pictures and stuff. I found it when I was a kid and asked him about it. He just said that was a different life and put it away." Trevor looked at Robert. "After he died, my grandma told me he saved his whole unit when they got ambushed. Carried 2 wounded guys to safety under fire. He sounds like a good man," Robert said. "He was, and I've been treating you like trash when you're probably just like him." Trevor stood up. "I gave your commissary card to Officer Gomez this morning. She's putting the money back in your account. And your phone privileges, I'm done taking those." "You don't have to," Robert started. "Yeah, I do," Trevor interrupted. "What you did, saving those people, fighting for the country. Man, I've never done anything that mattered like that. Least I can do is show some respect." After Trevor left, Robert sat there stunned. He'd come to prison expecting and accepting punishment. But forgiveness? That was something he didn't know how to handle. That Tuesday, Robert found himself walking to the library. He told himself he was just going to return a book, but somehow his feet carried him to the small room in the back where Vincent and 9 other men sat in a circle. They looked up when he entered, and every single one of them stood up. "Gentlemen," Vincent said, "this is Captain Robert Chen." They introduced themselves one by one. Marines, Army, Air Force, even one Navy veteran. All of them had served. All of them had seen combat. All of them ended up in prison for various reasons. And all of them understood the weight Robert carried. "We don't do formal stuff here," Vincent explained as they all sat down. "We just talk. About deployments, about coming home, about the stuff that haunts us. No judgment, no pressure. Whatever you say stays in this room." For the first hour, Robert just listened. He heard stories about IEDs and firefights, about losing friends, about coming home to a world that didn't understand what they'd been through. He heard about marriages that fell apart, about drinking problems, about anger that erupted at the wrong times. Then Vincent looked at him. "You want to share anything?" Robert opened his mouth to say no, but something different came out. "I was supposed to be in that vehicle. The one that got hit. I was supposed to be in the lead vehicle. But at the last minute, Sergeant Mitchell said his back was hurting and asked if we could switch positions. I thought he just wanted to ride in back because it was more comfortable." The room was completely silent. "The explosion killed everyone instantly," Robert continued, his voice shaking. "Mitchell, Lopez, Davis, Henderson, all of them. I was 20 feet behind and I didn't have a scratch, not one. And I keep thinking, if I'd just said no, if I'd stayed in that vehicle like I was supposed to, maybe Mitchell would still be alive. Maybe his kids would still have a father. Or maybe you'd all be dead," Vincent said gently. "You can't know. None of us can know what would have happened if we'd made different choices." "My son needed me," Robert said, tears streaming down his face now. "He was struggling and I was overseas. My wife called me, told me he was getting into trouble, and I said I'd handle it when I got back. But when I got back, she was gone and he was already using, and I didn't know what to do. I knew how to lead soldiers, but I didn't know how to save my own kid." One of the other veterans, a former Marine named Carl, spoke up. My daughter tried to call me 3 times the week before she took her own life. I was too drunk to answer. I live with that every day. But you know what my therapist told me? Guilt is just love with nowhere to go. You feel guilty because you loved them and you wanted to save them. But some people can't be saved, no matter how much we love them. Robert sobbed, really sobbed, for the first time since his son's funeral. These men, strangers a week ago, sat with him through it. Nobody tried to make him stop. Nobody told him to man up. They just let him grieve. Over the following weeks, something shifted in Robert. He started attending the group every Tuesday. He began talking to other inmates, sharing his experience, offering advice. A young kid who reminded him of his son approached him one day, asking about the military. Robert spent an hour telling him stories, showing him that there were paths in life beyond crime and prison. Officer Patricia noticed the change. Robert walked differently now, with his shoulders a little straighter. He'd gotten new glasses, and you could see his eyes clearly again. Those eyes still carried sadness, but there was something else there now, too. A tiny spark of hope. One afternoon, Patricia pulled him aside. There's a veterans advocacy group that works with inmates. They help with transition back to civilian life, job placement, housing, mental health services. I contacted them about you. They want to help. Why would they want to help me? Robert asked. Because you served your country with honor and you deserve support. What you did, the crime you committed, you're paying for that. But that doesn't erase your service. These people understand that. 6 months after the assembly, Robert appeared before the parole board. The Veterans Advocacy Group sent a representative. Letters of support came from Vincent and the other vets in the prison group. Even Trevor wrote a letter talking about how Robert had mentored him and helped him think about his future differently. The day Robert was released, the scene at the prison entrance was unlike anything the guards had seen before. Vincent and 3 other veterans who were also being released that month stood waiting. Officer Patricia was there. Officer James stood at attention in his dress uniform and gave Robert a crisp salute. Most surprisingly, Devin was there. He'd been released 2 weeks earlier and had come back just to see Robert off. You helped me see things different, man, Devin said, shaking Robert's hand. Made me want to be better. That's worth coming back to this place for one day. Robert walked out of Riverbend State Prison into the morning sunshine. A van from the Veterans Advocacy Group waited in the parking lot. They'd arranged transitional housing for him, a support group with other combat veterans, and a part-time job at a veterans center, helping other former soldiers navigate civilian life. As Robert climbed into the van, he looked back at the prison one last time. 4 months ago, he'd entered those gates believing he deserved every bit of suffering that came his way. He'd let himself be bullied and broken because he thought that was his punishment for failing the people he loved. But somewhere along the way, through the forced revelation of his past and the support of men who understood his pain, Robert learned something important. Punishment and healing aren't the same thing. He could serve his time for his crime and still deserve compassion. He could carry guilt for his losses and still deserve a future. The van pulled away from the prison. Robert watched it disappear in the side mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it was just a distant building behind him. He still carried the weight of his son, his brothers in arms, his failed marriage. Those weights would never fully disappear. But now, finally, he was also carrying something else. The possibility of forgiveness. The chance to help others who struggled like he did. The hope that maybe, just maybe, the rest of his story didn't have to be defined by his worst moments. Robert Chen had entered prison as a man who'd given up on himself. He left as a man who was learning, slowly and painfully, to believe he might be worth saving after all. And sometimes, that's the only kind of redemption that